Welcome to the Story Vault, where Miss Marple unlocks captivating mysteries.
In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a cryptic letter lures Miss Jane Marple to a midnight meeting at the abandoned old manor house. But what she finds is a body, stabbed through the heart, clutching a single word: betrayal. Who was the mysterious informant? Why did they summon Miss Marple? And what secrets drove a killer to strike in the shadows? As whispers of blackmail and hidden truths unravel, Miss Marple's keen mind pieces together clues: a pearl button, a blue scarf thread, a hidden cache of letters, leading to a shocking revelation that even the cleverest murderer can't escape. Will you uncover the truth before she does? Chapter 1. The Whisper of Suspicion. The village of St. Mary Mead lay draped in the soft hush of an autumn evening, its thatched cottages glowing warmly under the fading amber light. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and the faint tang of wood smoke, while the church clock tolled 6, its solemn notes reverberating through the narrow lanes. At the heart of the village, Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room at Mead cottage, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, the soft woolen shawl in her lap taking shape with each precise loop. To an outsider, she might have appeared a picture of serene domesticity. An elderly spinster, her white hair neatly pinned, her eyes bright behind spectacles, absorbed in her quiet craft. But those who knew Miss Marple understood that her mind, sharp as a polished blade, was rarely idle. The room was cosy, its chintz curtains drawn against the encroaching dusk, a small fire crackling in the grate. On the mahogany table beside her rested a cup of tea, now cold, and a letter, its edges slightly creased from repeated handling. The letter had arrived that morning, delivered by the postman with an air of unusual urgency, and its contents had set Miss Marple's thoughts racing. It was not the sort of letter one might expect to receive in St. Mary Mead, a place where scandal rarely rose above a whispered quarrel over a garden fence or a misplaced remark at the Women's Institute. No, this letter was altogether different, cryptic, urgent, and penned in a hand that trembled with either fear or haste. "Dear Miss Marple," it began, in a script that was elegant but unsteady, "I am in possession of information most grave, concerning a matter that threatens not only my peace but the lives of others. I dare not speak openly, for walls have ears, but I implore you to meet me at the old manor house, tomorrow at midnight. Come alone and tell no one. Your reputation for discretion precedes you. I am in desperate need of your insight. Yours in distress, a friend." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she set her knitting aside and picked up the letter once more. She had read it perhaps a dozen times, each reading deepening the faint furrow in her brow. The old manor house, a crumbling relic on the edge of the village, had stood empty for years, its ivy-clad walls and sagging roof a subject of local gossip. It belonged to the Bantry family, though Colonel Bantry and his wife Dolly had long since moved to a more modern residence, leaving the manor to the mercy of time and neglect. Why anyone would choose such a place for a clandestine meeting was a puzzle in itself, and Miss Marple did not like puzzles without answers. She rose, her movements deliberate, and crossed to the window, parting the curtains to peer into the gathering dark. The village was quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hum of a motor car. Yet Miss Marple's mind was far from quiet. she thought of her nephew Raymond, who often teased her for seeing mysteries in every corner, and of her dear friend Dolly Bantry, who would no doubt be horrified to learn of secret meetings at her abandoned property. But Miss Marple was not one to dismiss a cry for help, however vague or theatrical it might seem. She had learned, through years of quiet observation, that human nature was rarely as simple as it appeared, and that beneath the surface of even the most tranquil village lay currents of ambition, fear, and deceit. The clock on the mantel struck 6:30, and Miss Marple returned to her chair, her thoughts drifting to the cast of characters who might be entangled in this mysterious summons. St. Mary Mead was small, but its inhabitants were not without their secrets. There was Dr. Haydock, the village physician, whose brusque manner concealed a keen intellect and perhaps a private sorrow. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was a woman of boundless charity, but a surprising capacity for indignation when crossed. And then there was young Leonard Wiley, the new curate, whose earnest sermons had not entirely dispelled rumours of a troubled past in London. Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting, the needles moving almost of their own accord as she catalogued names, faces, and motives. She did not yet know the nature of the grave matter hinted at in the letter, but she was certain of one thing. Whoever had written it was afraid, and fear in her experience was often the prelude to a crime. The evening passed uneventfully, though Miss Marple's thoughts remained restless. She dined lightly on soup and toast, prepared by her maid Florence, and retired early, though sleep eluded her. At 11:30, she rose, donned a dark woolen coat and a sturdy pair of shoes, and slipped a small torch into her pocket. The night was cool, the sky a tapestry of stars, and the village was silent as she made her way along the lane toward the old manor house. Her steps were cautious but unhesitating, her mind alert to every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. She had told no one of her errand, as the letter had instructed, though she had left the letter itself on her writing desk, a precaution born of long experience. The old manor house loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the starlit sky. The iron gates hung askew, creaking faintly as Miss Marple pushed them open. The gravel path was overgrown with weeds, and the air carried the damp, musty scent of decay. She approached the front door, which stood slightly ajar, and paused, her hand resting lightly on the handle. For a moment, she considered turning back. After all, she was an elderly woman, alone in the dark, answering a summons that might well be a trap. But Miss Marple had never been one to shy away from the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The hall was vast and shadowy, the beam of her torch revealing cobwebs and cracked plaster. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew, and the floorboards creaked beneath her feet. "Hello," she called softly, her voice steady despite the eerie surroundings. There was no answer, only the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. She moved forward, her torch sweeping the room, and then she saw it. A figure slumped in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, motionless, a dark stain spreading across the front of a pale shirt. Miss Marple's breath caught, but her composure held. She approached cautiously, her eyes taking in every detail. The man's face, unfamiliar yet vaguely familiar, his hands folded neatly in his lap, a single sheet of paper clutched in his fingers. She did not touch him. She knew better than to disturb a scene before the police arrived, but she leaned closer, her torch illuminating the paper. It bore a single word, scrawled in the same unsteady hand as the letter she had received: betrayal. Miss Marple straightened, her mind racing. The man was dead, that much was clear, and the circumstances suggested murder, rather than accident or suicide. She glanced around the room, noting the overturned candlestick on the mantel, the faint scuff marks on the floor, the single window ajar despite the chill of the night. Whoever had summoned her here had not lived to tell their tale, and yet the clues they had left behind were already whispering to her, urging her to unravel the truth. She stepped back, her torch still in hand, and made her way to the door. The police would need to be called, of course, and questions would be asked, questions she was not yet ready to answer. But as she stood on the threshold of the old manor house, Miss Marple felt a familiar spark of determination. The game, as her old friend Hercule Poirot might have said, was afoot, and she, Jane Marple, would see it through to its end. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Death. The old manor house seemed to hold its breath as Miss Jane Marple stepped back from the lifeless figure in the chair. The single word, betrayal, etched on the paper clutched in the dead man's hand, lingered in her mind, sharp and insistent, like a note struck on a piano in an empty room. The air was thick with the musty scent of neglect, and the faint drip of water echoed somewhere in the darkness, a metronome to her racing thoughts. She stood, motionless for a moment, her torch casting long shadows across the decayed grandeur of the hall, her eyes scanning for details that might speak where the dead man could not. The man was not entirely unknown to her, so his name eluded her. His face, pale in death, bore the refined features of someone who had once moved in circles above the quiet simplicity of St. Mary Mead. His suit, though stained with blood, was well tailored, the cufflinks glinting faintly in the torchlight, a small but telling detail. Miss Marple's lips pursed as she noted the overturned candlestick on the mantel, its wax hardened in a pool on the dusty surface, and the scuff marks on the floor, irregular and hurried, suggesting a struggle or a hasty retreat. The window, slightly ajar, admitted a chill breeze that stirred the cobwebs, and she wondered if it had been opened by the killer or the victim. She did not linger long. Miss Marple was no stranger to death, but she knew the importance of preserving a scene for the police. With a final glance at the body, she retraced her steps to the front door, her shoes soft on the creaking floorboards. Outside, the night was still, the stars bright above the skeletal outline of the manor's gables. She made her way back to Danemead Cottage, her mind cataloguing every detail, her heart steady despite the grim discovery. Upon reaching her drawing room, she telephoned the police station, her voice calm as she reported the body to Constable Hurst, who promised to dispatch Inspector Craddock at once. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived at the old manor house, accompanied by 2 constables and doctor. Haydock, the village was stirring with the first whispers of scandal. Miss Marple, who had returned to the scene at the inspector's request, stood quietly to one side, her dark coat blending into the shadows. Craddock, a young man with a sharp jaw and an air of brisk efficiency, surveyed the scene with a frown. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mixture of respect and exasperation, "I should have known you'd be tangled up in this. Care to explain why you were here at midnight?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly behind her spectacles. "A letter, Inspector," she said simply, producing the creased note from her pocket. "Unsigned, but urgent." It requested a meeting here, and I could hardly ignore such a plea. Craddock read the letter, his brow furrowing. "A friend," he muttered. "Sounds like a trap to me. And now we've got a dead man on our hands." He handed the letter back and turned to Dr. Haydock, who was kneeling beside the body. "Well, Doctor, what's the verdict?" Dr. Haydock, a stout man with a gruff manner, straightened up. "Stabbed, straight through the heart. A single wound, clean and precise. Death would have been near instantaneous, likely between 11 and midnight. I'll need to examine further, but that's my initial finding." Craddock nodded, his gaze shifting to the paper in the dead man's hand. "Betrayal," he read aloud, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Melodramatic, isn't it? Any idea who he is?" Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately. "I believe, Inspector, that this is Mr. Reginald Carver. He visited St. Mary Mead some years ago, a guest of the Bantrys, a solicitor, I think, from London. He had a certain reputation for handling delicate matters." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Delicate matters? You mean shady ones?" Miss Marple's smile was faint but unyielding. "I mean, Inspector, that he was a man who knew other people's secrets. A dangerous profession, wouldn't you say?" The inspector grunted, clearly unwilling to concede the point just yet. He turned to his constables, issuing orders to secure the scene and search the grounds. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stepped closer to the fireplace, her torch illuminating the candlestick. The wax had dripped in a pattern that suggested it had been knocked over while still lit, and she noted a faint smear of soot on the hearth, as if someone had brushed against it in haste. Her eyes flicked to the window, where a single thread of blue fabric clung to the splintered frame. "Inspector," she said quietly, "you might wish to examine the window. It appears someone left in a hurry." Craddock followed her gaze, his expression tightening as he spotted the thread. "Good eye, Miss Marple," he said grudgingly, signalling a constable to collect it. "But let's not jump to conclusions. We'll need to identify this Carver fellow properly and find out who had reason to want him dead." Miss Marple inclined her head, her thoughts already racing ahead. Reginald Carver's presence in St. Mary Mead and his death in the old manor house suggested a web of connections that extended beyond the village's quiet lanes. She thought of the letter, its trembling script, and the word betrayal. Someone had lured Carver here, and someone had ensured he would never leave. But who? And why? As the police continued their work, Miss Marple slipped away, promising to be available for further questions. Back at Danemead Cottage, she lit a fresh fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. Her mind turned to the villagers who might have crossed paths with Carver. There was Mrs. Clement, whose charitable work often brought her into contact with strangers passing through. Leonard Wiley, the curate, had a nervous energy that suggested more than mere shyness. And then there was Miss Lavinia Price, the village spinster who ran the post office and knew everyone's business, perhaps too much for her own good. The clock struck 2, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She recalled a conversation at the Women's Institute months ago, when Mrs. Bantry had mentioned a dreadful man who had caused a stir during Carver's last visit. Something about a contested will, or perhaps a blackmail scheme. The details were vague, but Miss Marple's memory was long, and she knew where to begin her inquiries. Tomorrow, she would pay a call on Dolly Bantry. For now, she allowed herself a small sip of tea, her thoughts as precise and relentless as the ticking of the clock. A murder had been committed, and in St. Mary Mead, no secret could remain buried for long, not when Jane Marple was watching. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Curiosity. The morning after the grim discovery at the old manor house, St. Mary Mead awoke to a buzz of whispered speculation. News of Reginald Carver's murder had spread like wildfire. Fanned by early risers who'd seen the police vehicles and doctor. Haydock's motor car parked outside the manor's rusted gates. By 9 o'clock, the village post office was crowded with villagers exchanging hushed theories, while Miss Lavinia Price, behind the counter, dispensed stamps and gossip with equal efficiency. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not among them. She sat in the sunny morning room of Gossington Hall, the home of her dear friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, sipping tea and observing the world with her usual quiet intensity. Gossington Hall was a handsome Georgian house, its windows sparkling in the autumn light, its gardens meticulously tended despite the season's decline. Dolly Bantry, a robust woman with a cheerful disregard for decorum, was pacing the room, her hands gesturing animatedly as she recounted her shock at the news. "Jane, it's simply ghastly," she exclaimed, her voice carrying the faintest trace of excitement beneath her horror. "A murder, right here in St. Mary Mead, and in our old manor of all places. Arthur will be beside himself when he hears Colonel Bantry, a man of predictable habits, was away at a regimental reunion in London, leaving Dolly free to indulge her curiosity." Miss Marple, her knitting resting in her lap, listened with a faint smile. "It is most distressing, Dolly," she agreed, her tone gentle but deliberate. "But I wonder if you might recall Mr. Reginald Carver. I believe he was a guest of yours some years ago." Dolly paused, her brow furrowing. "Carver? Oh, yes, that dreadful man. A solicitor, wasn't he? Came down from London about 5 years ago. Something to do with old Mrs. Hartley's will. Caused no end of trouble, if I remember rightly. There was talk of him meddling in things that weren't his business, letters, secrets, that sort of thing. Arthur couldn't stand him." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Secrets?" she repeated, her voice almost a murmur. "Did anyone in particular take issue with him, do you recall?" Dolly sank into an armchair, her eyes bright with recollection. "Well, there was Mrs. Clement for one. She was furious about something Carver said at a dinner. Implied he knew more about her husband's past than he ought. And then there was young Leonard Wiley, who wasn't curate then, of course. He was just a lad, come to visit his aunt, Miss Price. Carver had some hold over him, think something about a debt or a scandal in London. Oh, and Lavinia Price herself. She called him a vulture in a suit once, though she'd never say why." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing these fragments of village history. Reginald Carver, it seemed, had been a man who thrived on the vulnerabilities of others. A dangerous trait in a small community where memories were long and grudges longer. She sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the window, where a gardener was raking leaves with methodical care. "And the manor," she said, almost as an afterthought. "Has anyone been seen there recently? Visitors, perhaps, or trespassers?" Dolly shook her head. "Not that I've heard. It's been empty since we moved here. The place is falling apart. Too expensive to maintain. Though I did hear from Mrs. Clement that some children claimed to have seen lights in the windows last week. Probably just village nonsense. But you know how stories grow. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was alert. Lights in the windows of an abandoned house were precisely the sort of detail that warranted attention. She set her teacup down and rose, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you, Dolly. You've been most helpful. I think I shall take a walk to the vicarage." Mrs. Clement may have more to share. Dolly's eyes widened. "Jane, you're not poking your nose into this, are you? Arthur always says you're too clever for your own good." Miss Marple's smile was demure. "I am merely an old woman with a fondness for conversation, Dolly. But conversation, you know, can reveal so much." The walk to the vicarage was short, the autumn air crisp and invigorating. St. Mary Mead was at its loveliest in the morning, with mist lingering in the hollows, and the scent of damp earth mingling with the fragrance of late roses. Miss Marple moved with her usual unhurried grace, her eyes noting every detail. The milkman's cart rattling by, the postman's bicycle leaning against a gate, the flutter of a curtain in Miss Price's window as she passed the post office. She was not surprised to find Mrs. Clement in the vicarage garden, tending to a bed of chrysanthemums with a vigour that suggested she was working off some inner turmoil. Mrs. Clement, a tall woman with a kind but strained face, looked up as Miss Marple approached. "Miss Marple," she said, brushing soil from her hands, "I suppose you've heard about the dreadful business at the manor." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft. "A shocking affair." "I understand you knew Mr. Carver some years ago." Mrs. Clement's expression tightened, her eyes darting to the vicarage windows as if to ensure they were not overheard. "Knew of him, yes," she said carefully. "He was an unpleasant man. Always prying, always hinting at things he had no right to know. He upset my husband once, over some nonsense about a parish fund. I told him to mind his own." Business Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Men like Mr. Carver often make enemies," she said. "Did you see him recently, by any chance?" Mrs. Clement hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. "No, not recently. Though I did hear he was back in the area. Miss Price mentioned something about a letter he sent, asking to meet someone at the manor." She wouldn't say who. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her face remained placid. "A letter," she mused. "How curious. And Miss Price, she must see so many letters in her work." Mrs. Clement's lips pressed into a thin line. "Lavinia sees more than she should, if you ask me. Always gossiping, always watching. But she's harmless." Really, Miss Marple thanked her and continued her walk, her thoughts turning to Miss Lavinia Price. The post office was her next destination, but as she approached, she saw Leonard Wiley, the young curate, hurrying down the lane, his face pale and his hands thrust deep into his pockets. He started when he saw her, his eyes flickering with something akin to fear. "Good morning, Mr. Wiley," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but probing. "A troubling day, is it not?" The curate nodded jerkily. "Terrible, Miss Marple." "Simply terrible. I heard about Mr. Carver. Awful business indeed," she said, watching him closely. "You knew him, I believe. From your time in London, perhaps." Leonard's face flushed, and he looked away. "Only slightly," he mumbled. "He was a solicitor." "Handled some matters for my family. Nothing important." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind was as sharp as ever. "Of course," she said. "Well, I mustn't keep you. The vicar will be expecting you, no doubt." As Leonard hurried off, Miss Marple stood for a moment, her gaze lingering on his retreating figure. His nervousness, Mrs. Clement's reticence, Dolly's recollections, all were pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking shape. She thought of the letter that had summoned her to the manor, and of the word betrayal scrawled in Carver's lifeless hand. Someone in St. Mary Mead had a secret worth killing for, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. She turned toward the post office, her steps purposeful. Miss Lavinia Price, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, would have much to say. And Miss Marple, with her quiet questions and unerring instinct, would be listening. Chapter 4. The Art of Asking Questions. The post office of St. Mary Mead was a small, cluttered establishment, its counter piled with letters, parcels, and the faint air of secrets that clung to every piece of mail passing through Miss Lavinia Price's hands. The bell above the door jingled as Miss Jane Marple entered, her dark woolen coat neatly buttoned, her eyes bright with purpose. The room smelled of ink and polished wood, and behind the counter, Miss Price looked up from sorting letters, her thin face sharp with curiosity. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice carrying the clipped precision of one who prided herself on knowing everyone's business. "I suppose you're here about that dreadful business at the old manor house. Poor Mr. Carver. Who'd have thought such a thing could happen here?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost disarming. "Indeed, Miss Price, it is most shocking. I understand you may have seen Mr. Carver recently, or perhaps heard of his return to the village." Miss Price's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "Heard of it, yes," she said, adjusting her spectacles. "He sent a letter through here a few days ago, addressed to someone in the village. I don't pry, of course, but I couldn't help noticing the London postmark. He always did have a way of stirring things up." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting bag resting lightly in her hands. "A letter?" she mused. "How interesting. Do you recall to whom it was addressed?" Miss Price hesitated, her fingers pausing over a stack of envelopes. "I don't make a habit of reading names, Miss Marple," she said primly, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But I believe it was for Mrs. Clement, or perhaps the vicar. People are so careless with their mail these days." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her mind registered the evasion. Miss Price's memory was famously exact, and her reluctance to share specifics was telling. "Of course," Miss Marple said smoothly. "You must see so many letters. It's a wonder you keep track of them all. Did Mr. Carver send any others, I wonder, or receive any?" Miss Price busied herself with a ledger, her movements a touch too brisk. "Not that I recall," she said, "though I did hear he was asking questions about the old manor house last week. Wanted to know who owned it, whether it was occupied. I told him it was none of his business, but he was persistent. Always was." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Persistent," she repeated. "Yes, that does sound like Mr. Carver. And did he mention why he was so interested in the manor?" "Not a word," Miss Price said, her lips pursing. "But I saw him walking that way one evening, just at dusk. Looked like he was meeting someone. Shifty, if you ask me." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped back into the crisp autumn air, her thoughts turning over this new piece of information. A letter to the Clements, Carver's inquiries about the manor, his secretive behaviour, all pointed to a man who had been searching for something or someone before his death. She made her way back toward Mead Cottage, her steps slow and deliberate, her mind weaving connections between the fragments she had gathered. By midday, Inspector Craddock arrived at her cottage, his face etched with the weariness of a man grappling with a case that refused to yield easy answers. He found Miss Marple in her garden, pruning roses with a precision that mirrored her approach to mysteries. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I hope I'm not interrupting. We've identified the body definitively as Reginald Carver, solicitor, aged 48, based in London. No family to speak of, but a reputation for handling no sensitive matters, as you put it." Miss Marple set down her secateurs and turned to him, her expression attentive. "And have you learned anything more about his business in Saint?" "Mary Mead, Inspector." Craddock sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not much. He arrived 3 days ago, stayed at the Blue Boar Inn under his own name. The innkeeper says he kept to himself, though he was seen talking to Leonard Wiley in the pub one evening. Looked like a heated conversation from what I hear. And then there's that letter you received. We're trying to trace its origin, but it's a slow process." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to a rosebush as if it held the answers to her questions. "A heated conversation," she said softly. "How curious. And what of the scene at the manor? Any new discoveries?" Craddock's jaw tightened. "A few. That thread you spotted on the window frame, it's from a woolen scarf, dark blue, common enough. We found footprints in the garden too, leading to the lane. Men's shoes, size 9, but the rain last night blurred them. And the candlestick, it had been lit recently, but no fingerprints, just smudges. Whoever did this was careful, but not infallible," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers brushing a rose petal. "The word betrayal, Inspector. Have you considered its implications? Mr. Carver was a man who dealt in secrets. Perhaps he betrayed one, or perhaps he was betrayed." Craddock raised an eyebrow, his skepticism tempered by respect. "You're suggesting blackmail?" "I suggest nothing, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "I merely observe that human nature is predictable in its unpredictability. A man like Carver would have enemies, and enemies have motives." Craddock grunted, clearly weighing her words. "Well, I'm off to question Wiley and the Clements. If you hear anything in that gossip network of yours, Miss Marple, you'll let me know." "Of course," she replied, her smile serene. "I'm always happy to assist." As Craddock departed, Miss Marple returned to her pruning, though her mind was far from the roses. She thought of Leonard Wiley's nervous demeanour, Mrs. Clement's guarded responses, and Miss Price's calculated reticence. Each had a connection to Carver, however tenuous, and each had something to hide. She recalled a conversation from years ago, when Carver had visited Saint, Mary Mead, and left a trail of unease in his wake. Mrs. Hartley's will, Dolly had said, had caused a stir. And there had been whispers of a missing document, a letter or a contract that had never been found. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she snipped. A wilted bloom, the old manor house, she thought, was not just a crime scene. It was a stage, carefully chosen for its isolation and its history. Carver's death was no random act of violence. It was a calculated move in a game that had begun long before the fatal blow was struck. She resolved to visit the Blue Boar Inn that afternoon, where the innkeeper, Mr. Dobbs, might recall more about Carver's final days. As she set her gardening tools aside, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of anticipation. The clues were there, scattered like petals in the wind, and she would gather them, one by one, until the truth was laid bare. For now, she would watch, listen, and ask her quiet questions, questions that in their simplicity would unravel the most tangled of lies. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The Blue Boar Inn, a quaint establishment at the edge of St. Mary Mead, was a hub of village life, its low-beamed ceilings and polished oak bar steeped in the chatter of locals and the occasional traveller. By early afternoon, the inn was quiet, save for the clink of glasses being polished by Mr. Dobbs, the innkeeper, a stout man with a ruddy face and a penchant for storytelling. Miss Jane Marple sat at a corner table, her knitting bag at her side, a pot of tea before her. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly lady enjoying a moment's respite, but her eyes, bright and watchful, missed nothing. Mr. Dobbs approached, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his tone hearty but tinged with unease. "Terrible business about Mr. Carver, isn't it? Never thought I'd see a murder in our village." "Most distressing," Miss Marple agreed, her voice soft. "I understand, Mr. Carver was staying here. Did he seem troubled during his visit?" Dobbs hesitated, his eyes darting toward the bar, as if to ensure they were alone. "Troubled?" "Well, he was a quiet sort, kept to himself mostly. Arrived 3 days ago, paid in advance. But I did overhear him on the telephone one evening. Sounded agitated, like he was arguing. Kept saying something about proof and no more delays." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to her thoughts. "Proof," she repeated. "How interesting." "And did he have any visitors, Mr. Dobbs? Anyone who might shed light on his business here?" Dobbs scratched his chin, his brow furrowing. "Well, there was young Mr. Wiley, the curate. Came to see him 2 nights ago. They talked in the lounge, and it got loud. Couldn't make out the words, but Wiley left in a huff, face red as a beet. And then there was a woman, the night before last. Didn't see her face, mind you. She wore a scarf, dark blue, pulled up high. She went straight to Carver's room, stayed maybe 10 minutes, then left in a hurry." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind seized on the detail of the scarf. A dark blue woolen scarf, like the thread found on the manor's window frame. "A woman," she said thoughtfully. "How curious." "Did Mr. Carver mention his plans for the evening he died?" "Not a word," Dobbs said, shaking his head. "He went out around 9, said he'd be back late." Never saw him again. Miss Marple thanked him and sipped her tea, her thoughts racing. The woman with the scarf, the argument with Leonard Wiley, the telephone conversation about proof. Each was a thread in the tapestry of Reginald Carver's final hours. She recalled Miss Price's mention of Carver's inquiries about the old manor house, and Mrs. Clement's guarded demeanour when questioned about him. The village was a small stage, but its players were proving to be complex, their motives veiled in half-truths. As she left the inn, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the church, where Leonard Wiley was likely to be found. The church of St. Mary Mead was a modest stone building, its stained glass windows casting dappled light across the pews. She found the young curate arranging hymnals, his movements jerky, his face pale. He started when he saw her, his hands fumbling with a book. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. I didn't expect to see you here." "I often come to the church for a moment's reflection," she said, her tone gentle but probing. "It must be difficult, Mr. Wiley, with all this talk of Mr. Carver's death. I understand you spoke with him recently." Leonard's eyes widened, and he set the hymnal down with a thud. "Spoke with him? Well, yes, briefly, at the inn. He wanted to discuss a matter from my past. Nothing important, really." Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her gaze was unrelenting. "Nothing important," she echoed. "Yet I hear it was a heated discussion. Was Mr. Carver perhaps pressing you about something uncomfortable?" The curate's face flushed, and he looked away, his fingers twisting together. "It was a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "He thought he knew something about me from my time in London. A debt I'd settled long ago. He was mistaken, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Of course," she said, "mistakes can be so troublesome, can't they? Especially when they involve a man like Mr. Carver, who seemed to collect other people's secrets." Leonard swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the door. I have duties to attend to, Miss Marple. If you'll excuse me." As he hurried away, Miss Marple remained in the church, her thoughts turning to the web of connections forming around Carver's death. Leonard Wiley's nervousness, the mysterious woman at the inn, the letter summoning her to the manor, all pointed to a secret that had cost Carver his life. She recalled the word betrayal scrawled in his hand, and wondered if it referred to his own actions, or those of another. Her next stop was the police station, where Inspector Craddock was sifting through reports. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of exasperation and grudging admiration. "Miss Marple," he said, "I might have known you'd turn up." "Found any more threads on window frames?" "Not today, Inspector," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "But I have heard that Mr. Carver was seen arguing with Mr. Wiley at the Blue Boar, and that a woman visited him the night before his death. A woman with a dark blue scarf." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "A scarf, you say? That matches the thread we found. And Wiley, his alibi's shaky. Says he was at the vicarage all evening, but Mrs. Clement was out at a Women's Institute meeting, and the vicar was in his study. No one can confirm Wiley's whereabouts after 9, Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the information. And the letter that summoned me to the manor, any progress in tracing it?" Craddock shook his head. "Sent from London, posted 2 days before the murder. No fingerprints, no return address. Whoever wrote it knew how to cover their tracks." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "But tracks, Inspector, are rarely covered as well as one thinks." As she left the station, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the woman with the scarf. Mrs. Clement, Miss Price, even Dolly Bantry, all were possibilities, though none seemed quite to fit. The scarf was a clue, but it was also a distraction, a red herring designed to lead the police in circles. Miss Marple knew better than to chase such bait. The truth, she was certain, lay in the subtler details, the overheard conversation, the missing document from years ago, the reason Carver had returned to St. Mary Mead. She returned to Dunmead Cottage as the afternoon light faded, her knitting resumed but her mind far from idle. The village was abuzz with theories, most pointing to Leonard Wiley as the obvious suspect. His argument with Carver, his nervous demeanour, his lack of a solid alibi. But Miss Marple was not convinced. The obvious, in her experience, was rarely the truth. Someone had lured Carver to the manor, and someone had ensured his silence. The question was not only who, but why, and what secret was worth killing to protect. As the clock struck 5, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and reached for her notepad, jotting down names and connections. The puzzle was far from solved, but the pieces were beginning to align, and she would not rest until they formed a clear picture. Chapter 6. A clue in detail. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, gilding the thatched roofs and softening the edges of the village's quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room at Danemead Cottage, her knitting needles idle for once, her gaze fixed on the small notebook in her lap. The pages were filled with neat, precise notes, names, times, connections, each a fragment of the puzzle that was Reginald Carver's murder. The word betrayal, scrawled in his lifeless hand, lingered in her mind. Ist, taunt and a clue in equal measure. She was certain that the truth lay not in the obvious, the argument with Leonard Wiley, the mysterious woman with the scarf, but in the subtler details that others overlooked. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Florence, her maid, announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who entered with a look of determined frustration. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into an armchair without ceremony, "this case is a tangle. Wiley's alibi doesn't hold up, but we've got no hard evidence against him. And that scarf thread, it's too common to pin on anyone specific. I'm starting to think we're chasing shadows." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Shadows, Inspector, can be most revealing when one knows where to look. Have you considered the candlestick at the manor? It was overturned, yet the wax had hardened in a pool, suggesting it was lit during the struggle. A curious detail, don't you think?" Craddock frowned, flipping open his notebook. "The candlestick? We noted it, but it seemed incidental. No fingerprints, just smudges. You think it's significant? I think," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "that everything in that room was placed with purpose. The candlestick, the open window, the word betrayal, they are pieces of a story, Inspector. And stories, in my experience, have authors." Craddock leaned forward, his skepticism tempered by curiosity. "You're saying the scene was staged?" "Not staged, perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "but arranged. The killer wished to tell us something or to mislead us. Consider the time, Inspector. Dr. Haydock placed the death between 11 and midnight. Yet Mr. Dobbs at the Blue Boar said Carver left the inn at 9. Where was he for those 2 hours? Craddock's brow furrowed. We assumed he went straight to the manor, but you're right, there's a gap. We'll need to retrace his steps. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. And the letter that summoned me. Have you learned anything more? Nothing concrete, Craddock admitted. The paper's standard, the ink common. Posted in London, as I said, but no trace of who sent it. Whoever wrote it knew you'd come, though. That's what bothers me. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Yes, she said softly. That bothers me as well. After Craddock left, promising to investigate Carver's movements, Miss Marple decided to revisit the old manor house. The police had cordoned off the hall, but the grounds were accessible, and she wished to examine the scene in daylight. She donned her coat and hat, her torch tucked into her pocket, and made her way to the manor, her steps unhurried but purposeful. The manor's gardens were overgrown, the rose bushes tangled with weeds, the gravel path crunching underfoot. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her eyes scanning the ground where the police had found footprints. The rain had indeed blurred them, but she noticed something they had missed. A small glinting object half buried in the mud near the path. Kneeling carefully, she retrieved it with a handkerchief. A cufflink, silver, engraved with the initials R.C., Reginald Carver's, no doubt. But it was not one of the pair he had been wearing when she found him. This cufflink was tarnished, as if it had lain in the dirt for days, not hours. Miss Marple tucked the cufflink into her pocket, her mind racing. If Carver had lost it earlier, perhaps during a previous visit to the manor, it suggested he had been there before the night of his death. She moved to the window where the blue thread had been found, examining the frame closely. The wood was splintered, but the splinters were old, weathered by time rather than freshly broken. The thread, she realized, might have been placed there deliberately. A distraction, like the overturned candlestick. Inside the manor, the police tape barred her from the hall, but she circled the building, noting the side door, half hidden by ivy. It was unlocked, its hinges rusted but functional. She pushed it open, revealing a narrow passage leading to the servants' quarters. The floor was dusty, but there were faint marks, scuff marks like those in the hall, but fainter, as if someone had tried to sweep them away. At the end of the passage, she found a small staircase leading to the upper floors. On the third step, caught in a crack, was a tiny pearl button, the kind used on a woman's blouse or glove. Miss Marple's breath caught. The button was a clue, small but significant, suggesting a woman's presence in the manor, perhaps the mysterious visitor Mr. Dobbs had seen at the inn. She pocketed the button, her thoughts turning to the women of St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Clement with her guarded manner, Miss Price with her sharp eyes, even Dolly Bantry, though her forthright nature made her an unlikely suspect. And then there was the possibility of an outsider, someone Carver had known in London, drawn to the village by his return. As she left the manor, Miss Marple felt the weight of the clues she had gathered. The cufflink, the button, the scuff marks. Each was a detail, seemingly insignificant, but in her hands they were threads in a tapestry of deceit. She thought of Carver's telephone conversation about proof and the letter's plea for her help. Someone had wanted Carver silenced, and they had used the manor as their stage. But why summon her? Was it to ensure the body was found, or to draw her into a trap? Back at Mead Cottage, Miss Marple spread her findings on the table. The cufflink, the button, her notebook. She added a new entry. Cufflink, R.C. tarnished, lost earlier. Button, pearl, woman's, recent, or planted. She sat back, her eyes narrowing. The killer had been careful, but not careful enough. The clues were speaking, and Miss Marple was listening as evening fell. She resolved to speak with Mrs. Clement again. The vicar's wife had been evasive about Carver, and Miss Marple suspected she knew more than she had let on. The button, the scarf, the letter, all pointed to a woman's involvement, and Mrs. Clement's connection to Carver, however distant, could not be ignored. Miss Marple's knitting resumed, the needles clicking in time with her thoughts. The puzzle was growing clearer, but the picture it formed was far from complete. She would need to tread carefully, for the truth, like the manor's shadows, was both elusive and dangerous. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, shrouding the village in a delicate veil that softened the outlines of its cottages and lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a slice of toast untouched beside her teacup. Her notebook open to the page where she had recorded the cufflink and pearl button found at the old manor house. The clues, small as they were, had deepened the mystery of Reginald Carver's murder, and her mind was restless with the connections yet to be made. The word betrayal, the scuff marks, the thread on the window frame, all pointed to a carefully laid plan, but one that was beginning to fray at the edges. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a visitor, Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly before her. Florence showed her into the drawing-room, where Miss Marple rose to greet her, her expression one of gentle concern. "Mrs. Clement," she said, gesturing to a chair, "how kind of you to call. I hope you are not too distressed by recent events." Mrs. Clement sat, her posture rigid, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. "The whole village is talking about Mr. Carver's death, and now the police have been asking questions about me, about my husband. It's unbearable." Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking, a soothing rhythm that belied the sharpness of her gaze. "The police are thorough, as they must be," she said, "but I sense there is something troubling you beyond the village gossip. Perhaps you would care to share it." Mrs. Clement's fingers twisted in her lap, and for a moment silence hung between them. Then, with a small choked sound, she spoke. "It's true that I knew Mr. Carver years ago. He came to St. Mary Mead about a will, Mrs. Hartley's. There was a dispute, you see, over a legacy meant for the church. My husband was involved, as vicar, and Carver. He suggested that my husband had mismanaged funds. It wasn't true, of course, but the accusation lingered. It nearly ruined us." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind seized on the revelation. "An accusation," she said softly. "How painful that must have been. And did Mr. Carver contact you again recently?" Mrs. Clement hesitated, her eyes flickering to the window. "He sent a letter," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "A week ago. He said he had evidence, documents, that could clear my husband's name or destroy it entirely. He wanted to meet at the old manor house. I didn't go, Miss Marple. I couldn't. I burned the letter and told no one." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. A letter, like the one that had summoned her to the manor. Carver had been weaving a web of secrets, it seemed, and Mrs. Clement was not the only one caught in it. "And your husband," she said gently, "did he know of this letter?" Mrs. Clement shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "No, I couldn't tell him. He's been so fragile since that time, so worried about his reputation. I thought if I ignored Carver, he'd go away." Miss Marple reached out, patting her hand. "You did what you thought best," she said kindly, "but perhaps you should tell Inspector Craddock. The truth, however painful, is always the safest path." Mrs. Clement nodded, her shoulders sagging, and left soon after, promising to speak to the police. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting untouched, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. Carver's letter to Mrs. Clement suggested he had been using his knowledge to manipulate, or perhaps to extort. But who else had he targeted? And why had he chosen the old manor house for his fatal meeting? Determined to learn more, Miss Marple made her way to the post office, where Miss Lavinia Price was sorting letters with her usual brisk efficiency. The bell jingled as Miss Marple entered, and Miss Price looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Miss Marple," she said, "I suppose you're still poking about that Carver business." The police were here again. Asking about letters, Miss Marple smiled, her manner disarming. "The police are thorough, as they should be," she said. "But I wonder, Miss Price, if you might recall any other letters Mr. Carver sent or received. You mentioned one to Mrs. Clement, but were there others?" Miss Price's lips tightened, and she busied herself with a stack of envelopes. "I don't read other people's mail, Miss Marple," she said primly. "But I did notice a letter Carver sent to Leonard Wiley 2 days before he died. It came through here, with a London postmark, and another to someone I didn't recognize, an address in London, not local." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "How observant you are," she said. "And did Mr. Wiley receive his letter in person? Or was it delivered?" "Delivered," Miss Price said, her tone grudging. "To the vicarage. He came here afterward, looking upset. Asked if I'd seen who brought the letter. I told him it was just the post, nothing unusual." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped outside, her thoughts racing. Carver had been reaching out to multiple people. Mrs. Clement, Leonard, Wiley, perhaps others, each with a secret he claimed to hold. The letter to an unknown recipient in London was a new thread, one that suggested the motive for his murder might extend beyond Saint Mary Mead. She recalled the pearl button found at the manor, and the woman with the dark blue scarf at the inn. Could they be connected to this mysterious correspondent? As evening approached, Miss Marple decided to visit the vicarage again, this time to speak with the vicar himself. Mr. Clement was in his study, surrounded by books and papers, his face drawn with worry. He rose as she entered, his manner courteous but strained. "Miss Marple," he said, "my wife told me of your conversation. I don't know what to say. This business with Carver has brought back such painful memories." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but probing. "I understand, Mr. Clement, but it seems Mr. Carver was revisiting old wounds. Did he contact you directly, or did you hear of his return through your wife?" The vicar hesitated, his hands clasping the back of his chair. "He sent me a note," he admitted. "Not a letter, just a scrap of paper slipped under the vicarage door. It said he had documents that could set things right about the Hartley affair. I didn't trust him, Miss Marple. He was a man who thrived on others' misery. I ignored it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the vicar's words. Another note, another promise of resolution or threat. She thought of the cufflink, tarnished and buried in the manor's garden, and the scuff marks in the servants' passage. Carver had been at the manor before his death, perhaps meeting someone, perhaps hiding something. And the word betrayal, was it his accusation or his confession? As she left the vicarage, the village was settling into the quiet of evening, the church clock tolling 6. Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of names and motives. Mrs. Clement's fear, the vicar's shame, Leonard Wiley's agitation, Miss Price's reticence. Each had a connection to Carver, each a secret he had threatened to expose. But the truth, she knew, lay in the details, the button, the cufflink, the timing of Carver's movements. She resolved to revisit the manor tomorrow, to search for any further clues that might have been overlooked. The puzzle was growing more complex, but Miss Marple was undeterred. Lies were surfacing, as they always did, and with them the faint outline of the truth. She would follow it, step by careful step, until the killer's mask was lifted. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The soft light of a late October morning filtered through the lace curtains of Mead Cottage, casting delicate patterns across Miss Jane Marple's drawing room. She sat by the window, her knitting untouched, her notebook open to a page dense with observations about Reginald Carver's murder. The cufflink, the pearl button, the letters, the word betrayal, each clue was a thread in a tapestry that was beginning to reveal its pattern. But it was the human element, the tangle of fear and guilt in Saint Mary Mead, that held her attention now. Someone, she was certain, was on the verge of breaking, and that break would bring her closer to the truth. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a hurried knock at the door. Florence ushered in Leonard Wiley, the young curate, his face ashen and his hands trembling. He stood in the doorway, clutching his hat, his eyes darting nervously as if expecting pursuit. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice hoarse, "I need to speak with you. It's about Mr. Carver." Miss Marple gestured to a chair, her expression calm but alert. "Please, Mr. Wiley, sit down. You seem distressed. Would you care to tell me what troubles you?" Leonard sank into the chair, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. "I can't keep it in any longer," he said, his voice breaking. "The police! They've been asking about me, about my argument with Carver at the inn. I didn't tell them everything. I couldn't. But I can't live with this guilt." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her gaze remained sharp. "Guilt is a heavy burden, Mr. Wiley," she said gently. "What is it you didn't tell the police?" He took a shuddering breath, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Carver knew something about me from my time in London. Before I came to St. Mary Mead, I was in trouble. A gambling debt, a foolish mistake. I thought it was behind me, but Carver had documents, letters I wrote, promising repayment I couldn't afford. He came to me 2 days before he died, said he'd expose me unless I paid him. I didn't have the money, Miss Marple. I told him to leave me alone, but he just laughed." Miss Marple's needles remained still, her mind cataloguing his words. "And did you meet him at the old manor house, Mr. Wiley? The night he died?" Leonard's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "No! I swear it. I was at the vicarage, preparing my sermon. But I did go to the manor earlier that day, in the afternoon. I wanted to reason with him, to beg him to let it go. He wasn't there, but I saw something, papers, hidden in a loose floorboard in the hall. I didn't touch them, I swear, but I think they were the documents he was using against me." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Papers," she said softly. "How curious. And you told no one of this?" Leonard shook his head, his face crumpling. "I was afraid. If the police found those papers, they'd think I killed him to keep them secret. But I didn't, Miss Marple. I couldn't." Miss Marple reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. "I believe you are telling the truth, Mr. Wiley," she said, her voice kind but firm. "But you must tell Inspector Craddock everything you've told me. Secrets, in my experience, only grow heavier with time." Leonard nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief and fear. "I will," he whispered. "Thank you, Miss Marple." As he left, Miss Marple sat back, her thoughts racing. Leonard's confession was a turning point, a crack in the facade of St. Mary Mead's secrets. The papers he described, hidden in the manor, could be the key to Carver's murder. A cache of documents that held power over multiple lives. She recalled Mrs. Clement's admission of a letter from Carver, the vicar's note slipped under the door, and Miss Price's mention of a letter to an unknown recipient in London. Carver had been a puppeteer, pulling strings of blackmail, and someone had cut those strings with a knife. Determined to investigate the manor again, Miss Marple donned her coat and made her way to the old manor house. The police tape had been removed from the hall, though a constable stood guard at the gate. She smiled at him, her manner disarming, and explained she wished to take a walk in the grounds for her health. The constable, accustomed to her harmless reputation, waved her through. Inside the manor the air was still heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Miss Marple moved to the hall, her torch sweeping the floorboards near the fireplace where Carver's body had been found. Leonard's mention of a loose floorboard intrigued her, and she knelt carefully, her fingers probing the worn wood. After a moment, she found it, a board that gave slightly under pressure, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside was a packet of papers tied with a ribbon, their edges yellowed but intact. Miss Marple did not open them. She knew better than to disturb evidence, but she noted their presence and replaced the board. She rose, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The papers could contain the proof Carver had mentioned in his telephone call, the leverage he held over Leonard, the Clements, and perhaps others. But why hide them in the manor? And why summon her to find his body? As she left the manor, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the pearl button and the blue scarf thread. The woman who had visited Carver at the inn was a missing piece, and she suspected it was someone close to the village's heart. Mrs. Clement, perhaps driven by fear for her husband's reputation, or Miss Price, whose sharp eyes missed nothing but revealed little. She recalled a fleeting detail from Dolly Bantry, a mention of a blue scarf Mrs. Clement had worn to a Women's Institute meeting, now missing from her wardrobe. Back at Mead Cottage, Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Craddock, informing him of the hidden papers without mentioning Leonard's confession. "You might wish to examine the floorboards in the manor's hall, Inspector," she said. "There may be something of interest." Craddock's voice was weary but grateful. "You're a step ahead, as usual, Miss Marple. I'll send a man over now. Anything else?" "Not yet," she replied, her tone serene. "But I have no doubt the truth will reveal itself soon." As she hung up, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open once more. Leonard's emotional outburst had shifted the case, exposing the depth of Carver's manipulations. But the killer, she knew, was still hiding, their motives buried in the secrets Carver had threatened to expose. The papers would provide answers, but they would also raise new questions. She thought of the word betrayal, and wondered if it was Carver's final accusation, or a warning to his killer. The clock struck noon, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The truth was close. She could feel it, like a melody just beyond hearing. She would need to tread carefully, for the next step would bring her face to face with the killer's mask, and the face beneath it. Chapter 9. The Trap. The afternoon light bathed Saint, Mary Mead in a golden glow, but the air held a chill that hinted at the approaching winter. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room, her knitting needles moving with their usual precision, though her mind was far from the soft wool in her hands. The discovery of the hidden papers in the old manor house had set the village abuzz, with Inspector Craddock's men combing the manor for further evidence. Miss Marple had not seen the papers herself, but Craddock had telephoned to confirm they contained letters and financial records, documents that hinted at blackmail, implicating several villagers in old scandals. The word betrayal, scrawled in Reginald Carver's hand, seemed to echo through her thoughts, a warning and a challenge. Miss Marple knew the time had come to tighten the net. The killer, she was certain, was growing anxious, their careful plan unravelling with each new clue. The pearl button, the blue scarf thread, Leonard Wiley's confession, the hidden papers, all pointed to a web of deceit that centred on Carver's ability to exploit secrets. But the killer had made one critical mistake. They had summoned Miss Marple to the manor perhaps to distract her or to frame another, and that mistake would be their undoing. She decided to gather the key players under one roof, a tactic she had employed before to coax the truth from reluctant lips. With Florence's help, she sent discreet invitations to a small gathering at Denmead Cottage that evening, ostensibly to discuss the village's upcoming harvest festival, but with a deeper purpose. The guest list was carefully chosen. Mrs. Clement, the vicar, Leonard Wiley, Miss Lavinia Price, and Dolly Bantry, whose presence would lend a casual air to the occasion. Inspector Craddock, informed of her plan, agreed to attend quietly, observing from the sidelines. By 7 o'clock, the drawing-room was warm with firelight, the tea-tray laden with scones and a silver pot steaming gently. Dolly Bantry arrived first, her cheerful chatter filling the room as she speculated about the murder. "Jane, you're up to something, aren't you?" she said, her eyes twinkling. "I can always tell when you've got that look." Miss Marple smiled demurely. "I merely wish to bring a little comfort to our friends, Dolly." These are troubling times. The Clements arrived next, Mrs. Clement pale and clutching her husband's arm, the vicar's face drawn with worry. Leonard Wiley followed, his hands fidgeting, his eyes avoiding the others. Miss Price was the last, her sharp gaze sweeping the room as if cataloguing every detail. Inspector Craddock slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the door, his notebook discreetly tucked away. Miss Marple began with pleasantries, pouring tea and commenting on the harvest festival plans. But as the conversation lulled, she set her cup down, her voice taking on a quiet authority. "It is a pity," she said, her eyes moving from face to face, "that Mr. Carver's death has cast such a shadow over our village. But I wonder if we might help the police by sharing what we know. After all, secrets have a way of coming to light, do they not?" Mrs. Clement's cup rattled in its saucer, and Leonard Wiley's face flushed. Miss Price's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The vicar cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "I'm sure we all wish to help, Miss Marple, but I don't see what more can be said." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her gaze was unrelenting. "Perhaps," she said, "we might consider Mr. Carver's activities. He was a man who collected secrets, you see. Letters, documents, promises broken. I understand, Mrs. Clement, that he wrote to you about a matter from years ago." Mrs. Clement's eyes widened, her hands twisting in her lap. "I told you, Miss Marple, I burnt that letter." It was nonsense, nothing more. "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "he wrote to others as well. To you, Mr. Wiley, about a debt in London. To you, Mr. Clement, about a parish matter. And perhaps to others we have yet to identify. These letters, I think, were his tools of persuasion, or perhaps coercion." Leonard Wiley shifted uncomfortably, his voice low. I told you everything, Miss Marple." "I didn't meet him that night. I swear it." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes moving to Miss Price. "And you, Miss Price, saw many of these letters pass through your post office. One, I believe, was addressed to someone in London. A curious detail, don't you think?" Miss Price's face remained impassive, but her fingers gripped her teacup tightly. "I don't read other people's mail, Miss Marple," she said sharply. "I told you what I saw, nothing more." Miss Marple's voice softened, but her words carried weight. "Of course. But I wonder about the manor itself. Why choose such a place for a meeting? It is isolated, yes, but also known to the village. Someone saw lights there days before the murder. And then there are the small things, the cufflink, the pearl button, the blue scarf thread, details that tell a story, if one listens." The room grew tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Mrs. Clement's eyes filled with tears, and she rose abruptly. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't kill him, but I did go to the manor that afternoon. I wanted to confront him, to beg him to leave us alone. He wasn't there, but I saw papers hidden under the floorboard. I didn't touch them, but I knew they were dangerous. I left, and I told no one." The vicar reached for her hand, his face pale. "Why didn't you tell me, Margaret?" he whispered. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "Thank you, Mrs. Clement. Your honesty is a great help. But I wonder, did anyone else visit the manor that day? Or perhaps the evening before, when a woman with a blue scarf was seen at the Blue Diashu? Boh!" Miss Price's teacup clattered to the table, and all eyes turned to her. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" she said, her voice sharp. "I had nothing to do with Carver." "He was a vile man, but I didn't kill him." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "I imply nothing, Miss Price. I merely ask. The truth, you see, is like a garden. It requires careful tending to bloom." Inspector Craddock, silent until now, leaned forward, his eyes keen. "Miss Marple's right," he said. "Someone in this village knows more than they're saying. Those papers we found, they mention names, debts, promises. If anyone wants to come clean, now's the time." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Leonard Wiley's hands trembled. Mrs. Clement clung to her husband, and Miss Price's face was a mask of defiance. Dolly Bantry, sensing the strain, tried to lighten the mood with a comment about the scones, but no one laughed. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes moving from face to face. She had set her trap, and the killer, she knew, was feeling the pressure. The papers, the clues, the confessions, they were closing in, and soon someone would make a mistake. She thought of the pearl button, the scarf thread, and the word betrayal. The truth was near, and she would not let it slip away. As the guests departed, their faces drawn, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her notebook open. The evening had revealed much, but the final piece was still missing. She would watch and wait for the killer to betray themselves. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The fire in Miss Jane Marple's drawing room crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the familiar chintz curtains and polished mahogany table. It was the evening following her carefully orchestrated gathering, and the air in St. Mary Mead seemed charged with an unspoken anticipation. Miss Marple sat alone, her knitting untouched, her notebook open to a page filled with meticulous observations. The papers found in the old manor house, the pearl button, the blue scarf thread, Leonard Wiley's confession, Mrs. Clement's tearful admission, all had brought her closer to the truth. But it was the subtle contradictions, the small inconsistencies in the villagers' stories, that had finally illuminated the killer's identity. Miss Marple had invited Inspector Craddock to Mead Cottage, along with the key figures in the case, Mr. and Mrs. Clement, Leonard Wiley, Miss Lavinia Price, and Dolly Bantry, whose presence ensured the event would not arouse suspicion. The room was arranged as it had been the previous evening, with the tea tray set out and the fire burning brightly. As the guests arrived, their faces betrayed a mix of curiosity and unease. Craddock stood near the door, his expression one of cautious expectation, his notebook at the ready. Miss Marple rose, her demeanour calm but authoritative, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I know these are difficult times with Mr. Carver's death casting a shadow over our village. But I believe we can bring clarity to this matter tonight by piecing together the truth." Mrs. Clement clutched her husband's arm, her face pale. Leonard Wiley sat rigid, his hands clasped tightly. Miss Price's lips were a thin line, her eyes darting from face to face. Dolly Bantry, sensing the gravity of the moment, remained silent, her usual cheer subdued. Miss Marple began, her tone measured. Mr. Carver was a man who dealt in secrets, secrets that gave him power over others he came to saint. Mary Mead with documents, letters and promises, threatening to expose old wounds. To you, Mrs. Clement, he wrote of a parish matter that could ruin your husband. To you, Mr. Wiley, he spoke of a gambling debt from your past. And to others, perhaps, he hinted at truths they wished to keep buried. She paused, her gaze settling on Miss Price. But it was not just his threats that brought him to his end. It was the place he chose, the old manor house, and the manner of his death. The word betrayal, written in his hand, was not a mere accusation. It was a clue, pointing to the heart of this mystery. Craddock leaned forward, his eyes keen. "Go on, Miss Marple, you've got our attention." Miss Marple's smile was faint but unwavering. "Let us begin with the night of the murder. Mr. Carver left the Blue Boar Inn at 9, but he was not killed until between 11 and midnight. Where was he for those 2 hours? I believe he was at the manor, meeting someone he trusted, or someone he thought he could control. The papers hidden under the floorboard, which Mr. Wiley saw but did not touch, were his leverage. But they were also his downfall. She turned to Mrs. Clement. "You admitted, Mrs. Clement, that you went to the manor that afternoon, hoping to confront Carver. You saw the papers but left them. Your honesty has been most helpful. But someone else was there that night. Someone who left a pearl button in the servants' passage and a blue scarf thread on the window frame." Mrs. Clement gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I told you! I didn't—" Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice gentle but firm. "I know, Mrs. Clement, the scarf thread was a distraction, placed to mislead us. The button, however, was not. It came from a glove, a woman's glove, small and delicate, the kind worn by someone who values precision." Her eyes moved to Miss Price, who stiffened, her face a mask of indignation. "Miss Marple, what are you suggesting? I had nothing to do with Carver's death." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Miss Price, you are a woman of remarkable observation. As postmistress, you see everything, letters, names, secrets. You knew of Carver's letters to Mrs. Clement and Mr. Wiley. You saw another addressed to a London recipient, but you did not mention its contents. Why? Because it was addressed to you, sent under a false name, threatening to expose a secret from your past. Miss Price's face paled, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "That's absurd. Miss Marple continued, her voice unrelenting. 5 years ago, when Carver was in St. Mary Mead, there was talk of a missing document in Mrs. Hartley's will, a codicil that altered her bequests. You were her confidant, Miss Price, and you handled her correspondence. Carver discovered that you had suppressed that codicil, ensuring it never reached the executors. He held that knowledge over you, and when he returned, he demanded payment to keep silent." The room was silent, the tension thick. Miss Price's eyes darted to the door, but Craddock's presence there was a quiet deterrent. "You went to the Blue Boar that night," Miss Marple said, "wearing a blue scarf to conceal your face. You met Carver, perhaps to negotiate, perhaps to plead, but he would not relent. So you arranged to meet him at the manor, where you knew he hid his papers. You lured him there with a promise of payment, but instead you brought a knife." Miss Price stood, her voice shrill. "This is outrageous! You have no proof." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "The pearl button, Miss Price, came from your glove, a glove you wore to avoid leaving fingerprints. The smudges on the candlestick confirm it, and the letter that summoned me to the manor, it was in your hand, disguised but unmistakable. You wrote it to ensure the body was found, to point suspicion at others, Mrs. Clement, Mr. Wiley, even an unknown woman with a scarf. But the word betrayal was your mistake. Carver wrote it as he died, naming you his betrayer." Miss Price's face crumpled, and she sank back into her chair, her hands covering her face. "He was a monster," she whispered. "He would have ruined me. That codicil, it would have taken everything, my home, my position." I had no choice. Craddock stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Lavinia Price, I'm arresting you for the murder of Reginald Carver. You'll come with me." As the constable led Miss Price away, the room erupted in murmurs. Mrs. Clement clung to her husband, tears streaming down her face. Leonard Wiley stared at the floor, his relief palpable. Dolly Bantry turned to Miss Marple, her eyes wide. "Jane, you're a marvel! How did you know?" Miss Marple's smile was modest. "It was the details, Dolly. The button, the letter, the word betrayal. They told a story, and I simply listened." As the guests departed, their voices hushed with awe and relief. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook closed. The truth had been revealed, as it always was, through patience and observation. She thought of Miss Price, driven to murder by fear and desperation, and of Carver, whose greed had sealed his fate. The puzzle was complete, but its cost was heavy, as it often was in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 11. The reflection, the morning, after Miss Lavinia Price's arrest, St. Mary Mead was cloaked in a quiet that felt both sombre and restorative, as if the village itself were exhaling after the storm of Reginald Carver's murder. The autumn sun filtered through the bare branches of the elms, casting dappled light across the lanes, and the church clock tolled 10 with its usual solemnity. At Danemead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a cup of tea steaming beside her. The notebook that had been her companion throughout the investigation lay closed on the table, its pages filled with the threads of a mystery now unravelled. Miss Marple's thoughts were calm but tinged with the melancholy that often followed the resolution of a case. The arrest of Miss Price had shocked the village, though not perhaps as much as it might have, in a place less accustomed to the complexities of human nature. Lavinia Price, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, had been a fixture of saint. Mary Mead, her post office a hub of secrets and gossip. Yet beneath her prim exterior lay a fear so profound it had driven her to murder, a fear of losing everything she had built, of being exposed as a fraud in the eyes of the village she served. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to the window where a robin perched on the sill, its bright eyes mirroring her own quiet alertness. She thought of the clues that had led her to Miss Price. The pearl button from a glove, the disguised handwriting of the letter, the deliberate placement of the blue scarf thread to mislead. Each had been a piece of a puzzle, carefully laid by a killer who believed herself cleverer than those around her. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that no one could outwit the truth forever, not when it was pursued with patience and an understanding of the human heart. The door opened, and Dolly Bantry bustled in, her face a mixture of awe and indignation. "Jane, you're positively uncanny," she exclaimed, settling into an armchair with a flourish. "Lavinia Price, of all people! I'd never have guessed it. How do you do it, picking up on these things no one else sees?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost self-deprecating. "It is not so much a matter of seeing, Dolly, as of listening. People reveal themselves in the smallest ways, a word, a gesture, a glance." Miss Price was careful, but her fear betrayed her. She could not resist leaving clues, you see, to point suspicion elsewhere. It is a common mistake. Dolly shook her head, her eyes wide. "But to kill a man! And all for some old document about a will. It's dreadful, Jane. What was in that codicil, anyway?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "The codicil, I believe, would have redirected much of Mrs. Hartley's estate to a distant relative, leaving Miss Price's inheritance, a small cottage she cherished, vulnerable. Carver knew this and used it to extort her. When he returned to St. Mary Mead, threatening to expose her, she saw no way out but to silence him. It is a sad thing, Dolly, how fear can twist even the most orderly mind." Dolly sighed, her indignation softening into sympathy. Poor Lavinia, she was always so proud, so proper. And now, well, what will happen to her? Miss Marple's expression was sombre. "That is for the courts to decide. But I suspect she will find some peace in confession, as Mr. Wiley did. Secrets, you know, are a heavy burden." Dolly nodded, then brightened. "Well, you've saved the day again, Jane." "The village is buzzing with it. Inspector Craddock was singing your praises at the Blue Boar last night, though he tried to pretend it was all his doing." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Dear Inspector Craddock is a capable young man. He only needs a nudge now and then to see what is before him." As Dolly chattered on, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the broader lessons of the case. Reginald Carver had been a man who thrived on others' weaknesses, wielding secrets like a weapon. His death, though tragic, was the inevitable result of a life spent manipulating those around him. Miss Price, in turn, had been driven by a desperate need to protect her place in the world, a need that blinded her to the consequences of her actions. It was a reminder, Miss Marple thought, that human nature was both predictable and unpredictable, a paradox that never ceased to fascinate her. She rose, crossing to the window to watch the robin flit away. "We are all capable of great good and great harm, Dolly," she said softly. "It is only a matter of choice and circumstance." Dolly looked at her, puzzled but intrigued. "You sound like a philosopher, Jane. But I suppose that's why you're so good at this. You see people as they are, not as they pretend to be." Miss Marple smiled, returning to her chair. "Perhaps," she said, "but I am only an old woman with a fondness for patterns. And people, Dolly, are the most intricate patterns of all." As Dolly took her leave, promising to return for tea the next day, Miss Marple settled back with her knitting, her mind already turning to the quiet rhythms of village life. The mystery of Reginald Carver's death was solved, the killer unmasked, but saint. Mary Mead would continue to hum with its small dramas and hidden truths. Miss Marple would be there, watching and listening, her needles clicking in time with the pulse of the village. She glanced at the notebook, its pages a testament to her method: observation, patience, and a deep understanding of the human heart. The case was closed, but her work, she knew, was never truly done, for as long as there were secrets in Saint. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple, would be ready to unravel them, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 12. The Echoes of Truth. The days following Miss Lavinia Price's arrest settled over Saint. Mary Mead like a gentle fog, muffling the sharp edges of scandal, but leaving a lingering unease. The village, though accustomed to its share of gossip, was unaccustomed to such a stark revelation of betrayal from one of its own. The post office, now managed temporarily by a young woman from a neighbouring town, felt strangely empty without Miss Price's sharp presence, and the villagers whispered their theories in hushed tones at the Blue Boar Inn and the Women's Institute. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained a quiet anchor amid the murmurs, her days resuming their familiar rhythm of knitting, gardening, and observation. At Danemid Cottage, the morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the neatly arranged tea tray and the open notebook on Miss Marple's table. She sat by the fire, her needles clicking softly, her thoughts drifting over the case that had so recently consumed her. The revelation of Miss Price as Reginald Carver's killer had been a triumph of logic and intuition, but it had also left a bittersweet aftertaste. Miss Marple understood, perhaps better than most, the fragility of human pride, and the lengths to which fear could drive even the most upright soul. Her reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. Florence announced Inspector Craddock, who entered with a sheepish smile, his hat in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into an armchair, "I owe you an apology. I was sceptical about your methods, but you've proven me wrong. Lavinia Price confessed everything last night, every detail, just as you laid it out." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "No apology is needed, Inspector. You are a thorough man, and thoroughness is its own reward. But tell me, what did Miss Price say?" Craddock leaned forward, his voice low. "She admitted to suppressing the codicil in Mrs. Hartley's will 5 years ago. It would have left her cottage to a distant cousin, and she couldn't bear to lose it. Carver found out, had a copy of the codicil somehow, and used it to blackmail her. When he came back to St. Mary Mead, he demanded a large sum, more than she could pay. She lured him to the manor, pretending to negotiate, and, well, you know the rest." Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing. "And the letter that summoned me?" It was her doing, as I suspected. Yes, Craddock said. She wrote it, mimicking Carver's hand to throw suspicion onto others. She thought if you found the body, you'd point the police toward Wiley or the Clements. She didn't count on you seeing through her. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Miss Price was clever, Inspector, but cleverness is no match for truth. The pearl button, the smudged candlestick, the word betrayal, they were her undoing. She could not resist leaving a trail, perhaps hoping to outwit us all. Craddock shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. But there's one thing I don't understand. Why did she choose the old manor house? It's so conspicuous. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the window, where a blackbird hopped along the garden path. The manor was a symbol, Inspector. It was where Carver first met Mrs. Hartley, where the codicil was drafted. Miss Price chose it deliberately, I think, as a stage for her final act. She wanted to confront Carver where his power over her began. It was a mistake, of course, but a very human one. Craddock nodded, jotting a note in his book. Well, the case is closed, thanks to you. The papers we found, letters, financial records, are being sent to London to clear up any loose ends. Wiley's debt is settled, and the Clements are in the clear. The village can breathe again. Miss Marple's smile was faint but warm. The village will always breathe, Inspector. It has a way of healing itself, given time. As Craddock took his leave, promising to keep her informed of the trial, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts lingering on the case. She thought of Miss Price, now facing the consequences of her actions, and of Carver, whose greed had sown the seeds of his own destruction. She thought of Leonard Wiley, whose confession had lifted a weight from his shoulders, and of Mrs. Clement, whose fear had nearly consumed her. Each had played a part in the drama, their secrets weaving a web that only patience and observation could untangle. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the village, her steps slow but purposeful. She passed the post office, where the new postmistress was sorting letters with a nervous smile, and the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was tending her chrysanthemums with renewed vigour. At the Blue Boar, mister. Dobbs waved cheerfully, his tales of the murder already taking on the embellished glow of village legend. Miss Marple smiled to herself, noting the resilience of Saint Mary Mead, its ability to absorb even the darkest truths and carry on. As she reached the church, she paused to speak with Leonard Wiley, who was sweeping leaves from the path. His face, though still pale, was lighter than before, his eyes clearer. Miss Marple, he said, his voice earnest, I can't thank you enough. You saved me from suspicion, from my own guilt. I feel I can start again. Miss Marple's smile was kind. You are young, Mr. Wiley. The young have a remarkable capacity for starting again. But remember, honesty is the best shield against secrets. He nodded, his gratitude palpable, and Miss Marple continued her walk, her thoughts turning inward. The case had been a reminder of the delicate balance between trust and betrayal, between the masks people wore and the truths they hid. She had seen it all before, in countless variations, and she would see it again. But for now, the village was at peace, and her work was done. Back at Danemaid Cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resumed. The notebook remained on the table, a silent, testament to her method, observation, patience, and an unerring sense of human nature. She thought of her old friend Hercule Poirot, who would have approved of her little grey cells at work, and smiled. The echoes of truth had sounded, and Saint Mary Mead was quiet once more. But Miss Marple knew that quiet was fleeting, and she would be ready when the next mystery called. Chapter 13. The Weight of Silence. The autumn days grew shorter in Saint. Mary Mead, the golden light of October giving way to the grey chill of November's approach. The village had settled into an uneasy calm, the shock of Miss Lavinia Price's arrest fading into the rhythm of daily life, though whispers of the murder still lingered at the post office counter and the tea tables of the Women's Institute. Miss Jane Marple, however, found no rest in the quiet. Her mind, ever active, turned over the details of Reginald Carver's death, probing for any loose threads she might have overlooked. The case was solved, the killer confessed, yet a faint unease persisted, like a note played slightly out of tune. At Danemed Cottage, Miss Marple sat by her drawing-room window, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her eyes were fixed on the garden beyond. The robin that had become her silent companion hopped among the bare rose bushes, its movements a small distraction from her thoughts. The papers found in the old manor house, the pearl button, the blue scarf thread, all had pointed to Miss Price, and her confession had tied the clues together neatly. Too neatly, perhaps. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she considered the possibility that the truth, while revealed, might not be complete. Her musings were interrupted by a visit from Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who arrived with a basket of late apples from Gossington Hall's orchard. "Jane," Dolly said, settling into an armchair with her usual exuberance, "you've done it again, haven't you? The village is practically worshipping you. But I must say, I'm still reeling. Lavinia Price! Who'd have thought she had it in her?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her hands pausing in their knitting. "People are capable of surprising things, Dolly, when they feel cornered. Miss Price was protecting her world, or what she believed it to be. It is a sad thing, really." Dolly's eyes narrowed, sensing the undercurrent in her friend's voice. "You're not satisfied, are you?" "I know that look, Jane. You think there's more to this, don't you?" Miss Marple's gaze returned to the window, her expression serene but thoughtful. "I'm an old woman, Dolly, prone to fussing over details. But there is one small matter that troubles me. The letter that summoned me to the manor. It was in Miss Price's hand, yes, but its tone, its urgency, it felt like a cry for help, not a trap. And the papers hidden under the floorboard. Why leave them there, where they could be found? Miss Price was meticulous. It seems inconsistent." Dolly leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "You think someone else was involved?" "But she confessed, Jane. She admitted everything. Confessions," Miss Marple said softly, "are not always the whole truth. They can be a shield, protecting someone else, or something else." Determined to settle her unease, Miss Marple decided to revisit the old manor house. She donned her coat and scarf, her steps steady as she made her way through the village. The manor stood as forlorn as ever, its ivy-clad walls silent witnesses to the crime. The police had removed their tape, and the grounds were deserted, the air heavy with the scent of damp leaves. Miss Marple circled the building, her eyes scanning the overgrown garden where she had found the tarnished cufflink. She paused at the side door, the one leading to the servants' passage, and stepped inside. The passage was as she remembered, its floor dusty, but marked with faint scuff marks. She moved to the staircase where she had found the pearl button, her torch illuminating the cracked wood. There, caught in a splinter on the second step, was another small object. A tiny fragment of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, with a single word in a familiar hand: "Forgive." Miss Marple's breath caught. The handwriting matched the letter that had summoned her, but the word was new, a plea or a confession that deepened the mystery. She pocketed the fragment and returned to the hall, her mind racing. Forgive. Was it Miss Price's final message, or someone else's? The papers hidden under the floorboard had contained letters implicating Leonard Wiley and the Clements, but nothing directly tied to Miss Price's own secret. Only her confession had confirmed the codicil's existence. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the London letter Miss Price had mentioned, addressed to an unknown recipient. Could it hold the key to this lingering doubt? Back at Mead Cottage, Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Craddock, her voice calm but insistent. "Inspector," she said, "I wonder if you might look into the letter, mister." Carver sent to London. Miss Price mentioned it, but we know little of its contents. It may be nothing, but I would feel easier if it were traced. Craddock's tone was weary but respectful. "You've got a nose for trouble, Miss Marple. I'll check with the London office. They're still sorting through Carver's records. If there's anything to find, I'll let you know." As she hung up, Miss Marple sat back. Her knitting resumed, but her mind far from idle. The fragment of paper, the word "forgive," suggested a deeper layer to the case. A personal motive, perhaps, or a connection yet to be uncovered. She thought of Miss Price's confession, so complete, so final, and wondered if it was meant to protect someone else. The Clements, perhaps, or Leonard Wiley, whose debt had been settled, but whose fear had been palpable. Or was there another figure, lurking just beyond the village's gaze? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she considered the possibility of a second player in Carver's death. Miss Price had acted alone in the act of murder, but had someone else known of her plan, or even encouraged it? The letter to London, the hidden papers, the staged clues, all pointed to a scheme larger than one woman's desperation. She resolved to speak with Mrs. Clement again, whose tearful admission had hinted at more than she had said. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open once more. She added a new entry. "Paper fragment, forgive, Miss Price or another." London letter, key to motive. The case was not yet closed, not in her mind. The weight of silence hung over Saint. Mary Mead but Miss Marple knew that silence, like all things, could be broken. She would listen, as she always did, until the final truth was revealed. Chapter 14. The Hidden Hand. The November chill had settled over St. Mary Mead, the village lanes slick with fallen leaves, and the air sharp with the promise of frost. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing-room at Mead Cottage, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The fire cast a warm glow across the room, but her thoughts were far from cosy. The fragment of paper bearing the word "forgive," found in the old manor house, had stirred a restlessness in her mind. Miss Lavinia Price's confession had closed the case for Inspector Craddock, but Miss Marple's instincts whispered that a deeper truth remained hidden. like a shadow just beyond the firelight. The morning brought a visit from Mrs. Clement, who arrived unannounced, her face pale and her hands twisting nervously. Miss Marple welcomed her with a gentle smile, ushering her to an armchair by the fire. "Mrs. Clement," she said, pouring tea, "you seem troubled. Is there something you wish to share?" Mrs. Clement's eyes darted to the window, as if expecting to see someone watching. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "I've not been entirely honest. About Mr. Carver, I mean. I saw something the day before he died. I didn't tell you, or the police, because I was afraid it would look suspicious." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady but kind. "What did you see, my dear?" Mrs. Clement took a shaky breath. "It was at the Manor in the afternoon. I went there, as I told you, to confront Carver about his letter. He wasn't there, but as I was leaving, I saw Miss Price in the garden, near the side door. She was speaking to someone, a man, I think, though I couldn't see his face. They was arguing, and she looked frightened. I didn't stay to listen, but I heard her say something about no more payments. I thought it was about the codicil, but now I'm not sure." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind seizing on the new detail. "A man," she said softly. "How interesting. And you're certain it was Miss Price?" Mrs. Clement nodded, her eyes wide. "Yes, I'd know her anywhere, even from a distance. I didn't tell the police because, well, I didn't want to make trouble for her. And after she confessed, I thought it didn't matter." Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "You've done the right thing, telling me now. Every detail matters, even the smallest." After Mrs. Clement left, Miss Marple sat back, her thoughts racing. The man in the garden, Miss Price's fear, the mention of no more payments. These suggested a layer to the case she had not fully grasped. She recalled the London letter Miss Price had mentioned, addressed to an unknown recipient, and her request to Inspector Craddock to trace it. Had Carver been working with someone else, someone who pressured Miss Price even after his death? The word forgive on the paper fragment took on a new weight, hinting at remorse or a plea directed not at Carver, but at another. Determined to follow this thread, Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Craddock, who sounded harried but attentive. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've traced that London letter. It was sent to a Mr. Henry Grayson, a private investigator Carver sometimes worked with. Grayson's known for digging up dirt, debts, affairs, that sort of thing. The letter mentioned a final arrangement and a meeting in St. Mary Mead. We're bringing Grayson in for questioning, but he's a slippery sort." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Thank you, Inspector. And might I suggest checking Mr. Grayson's whereabouts on the night of the murder? He may have been closer to St. Mary Mead than we think hanging up." Miss Marple turned to her notebook, adding a new entry. "Henry Grayson, London investigator, Carver's ally. In village on murder night?" She thought of Mrs. Clement's sighting of Miss Price arguing with a man in the Manor's garden. Grayson, perhaps, had been Carver's hidden hand, the one who supplied the documents that fueled his blackmail. But why would Miss Price meet him? And why argue about payments? Miss Marple decided to visit the Blue Boar Inn, where Mr. Dobbs might recall a stranger in the village around the time of the murder. The inn was quiet, the lunchtime crowd yet to arrive, and Mr. Dobbs greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple," he said, polishing a glass. You're a regular detective these days." Still sniffing out clues? She smiled, her manner disarming. "Merely curious, mister. Dobbs, I wonder if you noticed any strangers in the village last week. Perhaps someone from London. A man, not too tall, likely well dressed." Dobbs frowned, his hands pausing. "Now that you mention it, there was a fellow, the day before Carver died. Came in for a pint, didn't say much. Wore a dark coat, hat pulled low. Asked about the manor, said he was passing through. I didn't think much of it, but he paid in cash and left." Quick Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "Did he give a name by chance?" "No name," Dobbs said, shaking his head. "But he had a London accent, sharp-like. Looked like he didn't want to be noticed." Thanking him, Miss Marple left the inn, her thoughts whirling. Henry Grayson, she suspected, had been in St. Mary Mead, perhaps to pressure Miss Price, or to retrieve the papers Carver had hidden. Had he known of her plan to kill Carver, or had he been an unwitting catalyst? The word forgive suggested Miss Price's remorse, but it could also point to a betrayal of her own. Perhaps a promise to Grayson, broken when she took matters into her own hands. Back at Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her mind far from idle. The case was not as closed as it seemed. Grayson's involvement added a new dimension, one that extended beyond the village to the shadowy world of London's secrets. She thought of Miss Price's confession, so complete yet so protective, and wondered if she had taken the blame to shield another, or to ensure Grayson's silence. As the clock struck 4, Miss Marple resolved to wait for Craddock's report on Grayson. The hidden hand in this mystery was coming into focus, and she would not rest until every shadow was dispelled. The truth, she knew, was like a garden weed, persistent, tenacious, and impossible to ignore once it took root. Chapter 15, the final thread. The late afternoon light cast a soft grey glow over St. Mary Mead, the village settling into the quiet hush of a November evening. At Danemead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her drawing-room fire, her knitting needles still, her notebook open to a page dense with the final pieces of Reginald Carver's murder. The fragment of paper with the word forgive, Mrs. Clement's sighting of Miss Price arguing with a man in the manor's garden, and the mysterious London letter to Henry Grayson had stirred a conviction in her mind. Lavinia Price's confession, while true, was not the whole story. There was a hidden hand, a shadow behind the crime, and Miss Marple was determined to bring it into the light. Inspector Craddock telephoned just as the clock struck 5, his voice taut with urgency. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've got Henry Grayson in custody." He was in London when we tracked him down, but his alibi for the night of the murder is flimsy. Says he was at a club, but no one can confirm it. And we found something in his flat. A letter from Carver, dated the day before his death, mentioning a final payment and a meeting at the old manor house. Grayson's not talking, but I think you are right. He was in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her voice remained calm. "Thank you, Inspector." "Might I suggest asking Mr. Grayson about his dealings with Miss Price? I believe he may have been more than a bystander in this affair." Craddock promised to press Grayson further and hung up, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. She rose, crossing to the window where the last light of day illuminated the bare rose bushes. The word forgive, she mused, was not just Miss Price's plea. It was a message to someone else, someone who had pushed her to the edge of desperation. Henry Grayson, Carver's shadowy partner, fit the role perfectly. A private investigator with a knack for uncovering secrets, he had likely supplied Carver with the documents that fueled his blackmail, including the codicil that threatened Miss Price's inheritance. Miss Marple decided to pay one final visit to Miss Price, who was being held at the local police station pending her transfer to a larger facility. With Craddock's permission, she was allowed a brief meeting in a small bare room, where Miss Price sat, her face drawn but composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The postmistress's sharp demeanour had softened, replaced by a quiet resignation, but her eyes still held a flicker of defiance. "Miss Price," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "I believe you have told the truth about Mr. Carver's death, but not all of it. There was another, was there not? Someone who knew of your plan, perhaps even encouraged it." Miss Price's lips tightened, and for a moment silence hung between them. Then, with a sigh, she spoke, her voice low. "You see too much, Miss Marple." "Yes, there was another. Henry Grayson. He worked with Carver, digging up dirt for him to use. When Carver came back to St. Mary Mead, Grayson was with him, not in the village, but close by. He came to me, said Carver was getting greedy, demanding more money than we'd agreed. He told me the only way to be free was to stop Carver. I didn't want to, but he kept pushing, saying it was my only chance." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. "And the letter that summoned me to the manor? Was that Grayson's idea?" Miss Price's eyes dropped to her hands. "Yes. He said it would confuse things, make it look like someone else was involved. I wrote it, but he told me what to say. The word forgive, I wrote that after when I realized what I'd done. I wanted him to know I was sorry, that I hadn't meant for it to go so far." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind remained sharp. "And the papers under the floorboard? Did Grayson know where they were hidden?" "He did," Miss Price admitted. "He told Carver to hide them there, said it was safer than keeping them in London. But after I killed Carver, Grayson wanted them back. He was in the garden that afternoon, demanding I hand them over. I refused. I knew if he got them, he'd start where Carver left off." Miss Marple sat back, the final thread falling into place. Grayson had been the puppet master, manipulating Miss Price to eliminate Carver. Perhaps to take control of the blackmail scheme himself. The blue scarf thread, the pearl button, the staged clues, they were Grayson's touches, designed to muddy the waters. But Miss Price, in her guilt, had left the note with forgive, a plea that betrayed her accomplice. Returning to Danmead Cottage, Miss Marple telephoned Craddock with the new information. "Inspector," she said, "Miss Price has confirmed that Henry Grayson was complicit in Carver's death. He pressured her to act and orchestrated the letter that summoned me. You may find he intended to retrieve the hidden papers and continue Carver's work." Craddock's voice was grim. "That's enough to hold him, Miss Marple. Conspiracy to murder, at the least. We'll search his flat again. See if there's more evidence. You've done it again," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I have done nothing, Inspector, but listen to what people choose to reveal." As the village settled into the evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed, her notebook closed. The case was truly complete now. The hidden hand of Henry Grayson exposed. She thought of Miss Price. driven to murder by fear and manipulation, and of Grayson, whose greed had ensnared them both. The word betrayal had been Carver's accusation, but it was Grayson's betrayal of Miss Price that had sealed the tragedy. St. Mary Mead would heal, as it always did, its secrets buried once more beneath the surface of daily life. But Miss Marple knew that other secrets would rise, other puzzles would form. She would be there, watching and listening, her needles clicking in time with the pulse of the village. For now, the final thread was woven, and the tapestry of truth was complete.